Well, why we're holding this conference is because there's resolutions, there's remedies. And as Stephen so well articulated, we still have time to make changes. What has happened worldwide in the developed nations of the world is that our governments are now controlled by corporate interest. And corporations are the ones telling you there's no problem. Don't worry about anything. The environment's really not a bad thing. I'm going to be talking about 11 islands that are either sinking or gone, where people inhabited them, that literally lived on these islands, in some cases for hundreds and hundreds of years that are gone. The beach I've been walking on since I moved the Institute from Boston 30 years ago here to West Palm Beach is now gone. The only way we can walk on that beach, by the way, is when the good neighbors that I have on Palm Beach decide to spend tens of millions of dollars to put new sand in, which then takes about 8 months to erode again, so we don't have a beach. So these are very real problems. And I think the most poignant thing that Stephen ended with was very, very interesting. What he spoke to you about is that today it doesn't appear that what we're talking about is real. But in my work over the last 40-some years, I'm sitting across the desk from people that are the casualties of these problems. And the casualties over 40 years ago when I began were people my age in their 60s and 70s and 80s who had come to us very sick. But today, this week, as an example, in the last few days, I've talked to 7 people who were below 20 dying of disease. So that's what's happening. I'm going to also say that the powers that be skew statistics. You're hearing real truth here this weekend. But the truth of the matter is, they're going to have you believe that everything is wildly different than what it is. I still challenge the idea that we live longer than we've ever lived. I don't believe that. How we come up with that statistic is quite simple. When my grandmother was a little girl, infant mortality was a killer. Modern medicine has helped us quite a bit in that. Modern medicine created diagnostic tools that we can now see if a baby has an umbilical cord around her neck or his neck. They know if the baby's breached. And so we no longer try to pull the poor little baby out and strangle it to death. So infant mortality pretty much has plummeted to virtually very little in developed countries. Here to be ashamed, in our ghettos, though, in the poorest places in the United States, infant mortality is still a problem. But here's what I also want to say to you. That even if people were dying at birth and living to 100, doesn't mean that we live longer now. Statistically, to make this very simple, people would have died at 50. If we wipe out infant mortality because of modern science, it moves up to the 70s. Now, 70 sounded really good to me when I was 30. 70s do not sound very good to me now. If they said 170, I'd be very happy. So behind you, you're actually seeing some of the events that have just happened in the last 2 weeks. This was over in the wonderful mountains of the Himalayas, and earthquakes are happening. Now, let me give you a story that's almost impossible to believe. We have this wonderful state in our nation of 50 states called Oklahoma. How many of you know where Oklahoma is? Yeah. And in Oklahoma, they were having an extraordinary amount of earthquakes. As a matter of fact, it wasn't known for earthquakes there. So they were having these exceptional thousands of earthquakes. So of course, the political leaders in the state of Oklahoma said, well, let's figure out what's going on. And they commissioned a multi-million-dollar study. And the top university said, here's the report. And here they sat, the Senate with the report, and all unanimously agreed it was because of fracking. Now, how many of you know what fracking is? That's where we go in to get natural gas. They make you feel it's good because the word natural is attached to it. And seemingly, when you pull from Mother Earth, from her veins, her blood, and that's what we're doing, the big mother, we're putting needles into her and pulling it out, that she's not happy. When you go to the doctor and he gives you a needle or she gives you a needle, do you shake sometimes? Well, that's what the earth is doing. So here they had the report right in front of them, and they said, wow, that's interesting. The smartest people we have in America and here at our universities literally are saying that fracking causes earthquakes. Less than 24 hours later, the same group of politicians voted that you cannot prevent fracking. Local governments, communities, towns, counties cannot prevent fracking. So this is why we have to have the Real Truth About Health conference, so that you, the citizens globally, not just American citizens, but all of the countries around the world listening to us now, we will create what we began 3 years ago with the Real Truth About Health conferences, what I choose to call the army of love. Not the angry people, not the antisocial people, but the people. It's time that the people, that you and I, worldwide, we come together and we stand for truth. And we must be strong enough and capable enough and courageous enough, in spite of the fact that the other side looks very powerful, to absolutely, in an unwavering way, speak from our heart. Because this is the future of humanity. We cannot survive. Now, when I was a much younger man, I decided to start investigating many subjects, and if you know the work I do, I've pretty much become the investigator that wipes out different philosophies and theologies out there. I started with the natural health industry, by the way. Again, another industry. Do you realize that over 91% of all supplements made are dangerous for you to take? The word natural is slapped on the side of it. It has about as much to do with natural as petrochemical do. Well, petrochemical is natural, by the way. But how many of you are ingesting petrochemicals out there and around the world? You say no? You bet you are. Because most supplements you are taking are made out of oil. The same oil that you put into your automobile. My wife and I became acutely interested in the problem that clothing, yes, clothing. All of you, unless you're at home nude, are wearing clothes as we speak here. Matter of fact, some of them in the audience here are nude. You should be here. Where she says. She wants to sit next to that person. Do you realize that clothing are also made out of oil, petrochemicals? So if you don't make choices to wear natural fiber clothing, you may be eating organic food and be conscious and be an environmental warrior and killing yourself and the planet by making choices of wearing polyester and nylon and viscose. And even the natural fiber clothes that say you don't have to iron them happen to have formaldehyde on them. So you could be inhaling formaldehyde all day long at your workplace. You could actually be wearing polyester that looks like silk, pajamas that have formaldehyde on it and other deadly chemicals, and as you sleep, you could be inhaling cancer-causing chemicals. Doesn't that sound great? So the clothing industry, which literally is an offspring of the petrochemical industry. A book that I published last year is called Dairy Deception. Now, most of us listening here in the auditorium as well as globally, we're told that you couldn't survive without dairy. As a matter of fact, I was a major dairy consumer. My family would have been better off having a herd of dairy cows because I cost an awful lot of money to that family. I used to drink, liter after liter, quart after quart of dairy daily because we were intimidated by the innocent and naive teachers at school who were intimidated by government rulings that said dairy is necessary or your bones would crumble. And, of course, I had a biblical view of this. I used to always think of Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember, they'd be running out of the city, and you'd look back and hear the towers were crumbling. Well, I kept drinking milk thinking, oh, my bones are going to be like those towers crumbling. And so in this book, Dairy Deception, I not only talk about dairy because seemingly my colleagues have not found a way to talk about eggs, I put eggs in that book too. These are deadly non-foods for humans. Deadly non-foods for humans. That, as a matter of fact, you're going to hear me as I start to go through a trilogy of new facts and statistics and data, which I'm reading perpetually. Dr. Anna Marie and I go to bed at night reading, get up reading. She allows me to kiss her once a week, but we read in between. Read. Because that data is coming out like crazy. Do you realize that one of the number one causes for osteoporosis is the consumption of dairy food? How many of you know that? The very thing you and I worldwide were taught prevent the bones from crumbling, cause the bones to crumble. Eggs, which they've repackaged, and Madison Avenue, the marketers now have you believing it's a real food. Real people eat eggs. If you're a fox, I guess it's good. Because the fox has the enzymatic ability, the enzymes within their little bodies to digest an egg. You don't. An experiment I challenge all of you to do who still purport that eggs are good for you is to get vinegar and boil it in there. And after a few minutes, take the shell off, and you can bounce that egg like a rubber ball. Matter of fact, it will last for months because the coagulated proteins in egg are almost like glue. They have no ability in the human body to digest, but they do leave behind some really great gifts. One egg has about 230 grams of cholesterol. You don't need to eat an ounce, a speck of cholesterol. Your body produces that. And if you have a healthy body by eating a plant-based diet, you actually are going to produce healthy cholesterol. And you need cholesterol because the brain requires that, and the cardiovascular system requires that. But you don't need it from eggs or dairy or meat or chicken or fish. Another book I wrote. Now, Stephen alluded to this, but let's get into some details. So the book is called Killer Fish. And in that book, I literally knocked out the idea that fish is a health food. Anyone that would think fish is a health food, I guess I could convince you that cardboard with bad ink on it is a good thing to eat. Because fish is absolutely, horrifically impossible to consider to be natural and healthy for you. Now, I'm not going to speak about the usual suspect first. The usual suspect is it not only has mercury in it, which is we're always pointing mercury. It has lead and it has cadmium in it and it has radioactivity in it. And how many of the fish? All of the fish. This is an isolated fish off Newark, New Jersey, or off London, England. We're talking about fish in the North Pole and the South Pole. There's not a fish that has been tested by marine biologists and oceanographic scientists over the last several decades anywhere on the planet Earth, North and South Pole, that isn't highly contaminated. Some added things I'm going to put on top of that is that plastics are in all of this fish and pharmaceutical drugs. Yes, let me repeat that the pharmaceutical industry does not realize they have a secondary consumer. After you consume it and you pass it through your anatomy, it ends up in our water system and doesn't seem to break down for thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not God knows how many years. Just doesn't break down. It's manipulated biology. So here in my state of Florida, where all of you are listening to us from today, I put a report in our magazine, Healing Our World, about the west coast of Florida, about an hour's drive west of us here, where small whales and sharks were grounding themselves, literally coming up on the beach. So they thought, well, gee, it must be sonar from the Navy ships, because they practice Navy types of activity off the coast. And when they opened up these poor little shark and poor little whale, they found Prozac in such high amounts that these poor animals literally got goofy. And they didn't know which way the water was. It sounds like most of you after eating hamburgers. You don't know how to drive a car or walk straight. And so these poor fish are getting Prozac. But where is that again? It's everywhere on the planet Earth. Now, when I was speaking to when I was interviewing one of the top oceanographic marine biologist scientists on Earth, I asked a question, and he came back with a very cunning answer, which I'm happy he did. I was a little shaken at the time. I said, well, how the heck does pharmaceutical drugs go to places in the world that are 10,000 miles away from where humans inhabit it? He said, I thought I was talking to somebody with reasonable intelligence. Have you ever heard about rain? Because these are so small, they're smaller than molecules, smaller than atoms, and they're protons. And so they're very easy, they're almost nano, to evaporate with the water and go up into the sky and be evenly distributed globally. How about the big land dump we have in the Pacific Ocean? Most people don't even know about this. I would say that 1 out of 5 people I speak to are aware that the largest dump where we throw garbage on the planet Earth, it's larger than the state of California. Now, if you're not an American to us now, I'll explain what that means. If I'm in San Diego at the border of Mexico, and I drive like I normally do at 80 miles an hour, it's going to take us 14 to 15 hours to get to the other side of California, which is on the border of Oregon. This land dump that's floating in the Pacific is made of plastic, and it's larger than that state, larger than California. I didn't know this until I was investigating for my book, Killer Fish, that for a couple of decades or more, ships that come from Asia to the western part of North America, be it Vancouver to Mexico, have navigated around that big glob of plastic. Now there's documentaries. Since news in most of our countries are controlled now by corporate interest, there's a new emerging way to be educated, and that's documentaries. You're going to see some great documentaries, starting with my colleague tonight, Gary Knoll, who I applaud for his work of decades. And he's going to be showing one that's going to expose a lot of what we're talking about today. But also there's a documentary on this large land dump, on plastics. So you may want to Google this worldwide and see, they go out and they dive on this, they go underneath it, and they show it degradating. And as the plastic breaks down, the poor little fish say, oh my God, it's plankton. And they eat it. And then you go above, and it's so hot, even in the middle of winter, the sun rays come down and they hit that water. And that's where most of the rain comes worldwide, and it evaporates it. Well, you actually see the fumes, as you would call them, particulate, come up in the rain and go to the clouds. One problem after another. As a matter of fact, when I was a very young man and I began my work, my medical mentor, Dr. Peer, who was a Harvard guy from the late 20s, he graduated, said to me, young man, as you grow older, you're going to realize what they tell you is true is the opposite of truth. And I didn't want to know that in my 20s, but I certainly know that now. That usually what the gold standard is, what we're taught and educated at even the top universities, is diversely the opposite of truth. Now, how could we have created a culture worldwide that is so deceptive, that is so wrong? Because you and I still think today that it's only business that's manipulating us in the 21st century. This has been happening for a very, very, very long time. For millennia, the powers that be, the insecure that want control because their lives are out of control, and they do it with the card called money, have been guiding our university education, have been guiding political correctness, and have been telling us that everything's fine, don't worry, we'll take care of it. And now in the 21st century, where all of us are dependent upon materialism, I sit here and preach against it. I am a dependent person on materialism. I may not be as material as some people, but I'm material. I happen to drive here in a car. How many of you came here in cars or planes or trucks? Okay. That's a material act. How many of you are wearing shoes or clothing? You follow what I'm saying? You're not making these things. You're not growing your cotton anymore. You're not doing these things. So all of us are dependent upon this. Now there's a percentage, and an ever-growing percentage globally of people who are awakening and realizing we have a problem. I always equate this to being like an alcoholic. When you're drinking, you never know you have a problem. You ever notice that? Then one day you wake up and say, oh my God, look it, I have a problem. Just like Stephen so well articulated, you go to an 18-year-old kid like I was, smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and that's what I was doing, by the way. I thought it was cool. Can you imagine? Because somebody convinced me that. In my day, you know, when you're a young man and you're trying to find your sexuality and your machivoism, as we say, they always showed us a cowboy that was unshaven on a horse. You know, I said, I want to be like him. I bet he has a lot of girlfriends, you know. So all at once, that cowboy always had a cigarette dangling over here, right? So you get one, you get two, and before you know it, if you look at what they put in the cigarette, it's meant to be addictive. What they put in soda is meant to be addictive. So I was coming onto a stage 3-4 years ago, and a gentleman that was, at that point, not in my favor, let's put it that way. He was a former head of the Food and Drug Administration, which I consider part of the evil empire, the Food and Drug Administration. He literally grabbed me by the hand, looked me in the eyes, and said, I used to think guys like you were quacks, but no more. So that broke the ice in a really quick way. I didn't know what to say. And there was 800 people in the room, and I was about ready to speak, and most of them were professionals. So to be polite, because my mom and dad did teach me to be polite, I said, well, what are you doing, Dr. Kessler? And he said, focused on childhood obesity. And he said, something you may want to know is my investigations led me to understand now that every major international food company, multinational food company, has chemists on their payroll that their entire job is to put synthetic opiates into the food. So listen to what I'm saying closely in this room and around the world. That every major food company, probably the cookies many of you are or have eaten, the chips you have and are eating, the fast foods you are or have eaten, literally have synthetic opiates in it. Being a little stunned by this statement by a man a second before I thought was the other side, I said, isn't that illegal? He said, no, it's synthetic. He said, opiates are illegal, but not synthetics. I said, what happens if they find out they're addictive? He said, they have another 4 or 5 formulas ready to go in after that. He said, do you realize that they actually have conventions? And it's called hyperpalatability conventions. Write that down, hyperpalatability. So that means heightened sense of taste. So why you get addicted to these foods, don't think you're just a bad person who's a hopeless addict. You may be, as I was. The reality is, there's a reason you're a hopeless addict now. It's not only the sugar's not enough. The book I'm writing right now, it should be out later this year, is called Sweet Disease. Because when I go out and I speak to professional groups, they constantly are critical when I tell people not to even eat fruit if you're sick. And if you're not sick, only a very, 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 very minimal amount of fruit. And they throw things at me, and that's bad because nobody wants to give up dope. You just want to call it a different dope, right? Oh, I gave up white sugar, I gave up honey, I gave up maple syrup. How about mangoes? No, I don't want to give up mangoes. Because mangoes have a good reputation, you know? So in my book, Sweet Disease, and in this conference, the last day, I'm going to be making an hour-and-a-half presentation on the latest science on this from Stanford University, University of California, San Francisco, where I got to speak recently, the German Cancer Institute over there with a lot of the doctors. There is overwhelming evidence that even fruit sugar feeds cancer, creates osteoporosis, higher amounts of sugar than even the high amount we consume doubles your chance of heart attacks. Now, who of you ever thought heart attacks and sugar? I would have had a heart attack running after getting the sugar. Remember the trucks that used to have ice cream when you were a child? When that truck, the bell came, the entire neighborhood of addicted children, like glazed eyes, we'd run in the summer after those trucks. And our parents didn't ever say no, they gave us money. Well, keep little Johnny quiet over there. He'll be sucking on sugar for a while. But God forbid if mom and dad said to us not to have a pop or a little tiny ice cream. We would have jumped up and down and screamed and had convulsions because we were already addicts at that age. How many of you realize that baby foods, even natural baby foods today, that you pay 4 or 5 times more, even organic natural baby foods, are riddled with sugar? And it's not for the baby. By the way, the baby comes here unaddicted. The baby comes here totally conscious, totally aware, totally unaddicted. But mom, who tasted, 1 for you. Oh, wait, excuse, 2 for me. 1 for you. They want sugared in there. In my generation, the baby food was 50% sugar. Can you imagine that? So if you had a little container, 50% of it was sugar. So we're sugar addicts today. So no wonder we're able to be conned and lied to. And we sit back on our couches and our easy chairs at home with a clicker. They've made it so our fat behinds do not have to get up anymore and change the television. Yeah. We actually have clickers. And now we have, in many homes, you have an opportunity to have 800, 1,000 channels you can watch. And so you can sit back there, laid back in your seat, eating sugar, eating fat, and clicking away. And what do you think the commercials are? You ever notice the major advertisers now globally, because until 1996 in this country, you could not advertise drugs on TV. Did you know that? Till 1996, the pharmaceutical industry actually had to use somebody called a medical doctor to prescribe a drug. Then they realized so many sick people and such an opportunity here with customers that we basically just tell the patient to ask the doctor for the drug. And so what happened in 1996 in this country, and now it's globally, my wife's country of Sweden just fell about a year ago, and I'm watching this, now you can see commercials. So the 2 kind of commercials on international TV are food commercials to eat horribly bad things that make you sick, and then the remedy is the next commercial. Here's the drug after you get sick you can take. Now, somebody should wake up along the way and say, wait a minute, if I stop doing that, maybe I don't need this. But nobody seems to wake up to any of this. They just sort of go along with the program. I was going with the program, and it felt good to go along with the program, right? You didn't have to be odd. You didn't have to talk against anyone. Everyone you knew was doing the same thing. In the United States of America, we always say we're number 1, and we are still number 1 in some things. We're number 1 in consuming drugs. So I want the Americans in this, we have people from all over the world here, I want the Americans alone to applaud for our country. 7 out of 10 Americans take a pharmaceutical drug. Come on. We are number 1. Can you imagine that means men, women, and children? In this nation today, as we speak, we have 320 million citizens with men, women, and children. And 7 out of 10 of us take at least 1 drug. If you get to be a ripe old age, my next giant birthday, I'm going to be 70. I can't believe that. I keep saying to my wife, can you imagine that? I said to my wife, how could I ever end up with a grandmother? She's, how about a grandfather? And at 70 years old, 99% of the U.S. public, and unfortunately our Canadian friends, are taking at least 1 drug. The average 70-year-old takes 5 medicines. Now think of what I've just said to you. 5 medicines. Which, by the way, if you keep going to doctors they don't have time. It's not the doctors are bad guys. They don't have time. They have 10 minutes to see you. If you're lucky, if at the hospital, 10 minutes is too much. They may fire the guy if he sees you for 10 minutes. 2 minutes, that's it. You can do what you don't get in. What do you say? It's like a crazy show, you know? It's like the Marx Brothers. We laugh at the Marx Brothers. You shouldn't be laughing at depositing hundreds of dollars with this crazy show. What's wrong with you? I don't know. Okay, let's go. Next. So the one doctor doesn't have the time, even if she or he wants to ask you, what are you on? So now you may go to 5 doctors, get 5 drugs, and you can go down to your local bookstore or today with the internet, get on the internet, very inexpensive little paperback book for about $5 US, or the internet for free, and look at the counters between medicines. Now, do you realize that also America is number 1 in something else? In 2013, we became the first country in history, number 1, again in country in history, that had more people die of pharmaceutical drugs than we did recreational drugs. Come on, Americans. Give ourselves a hand with this one. We are really leading the world in this. Isn't it? Aren't we proud to lead the world in this, to be consumers? So let's talk a little bit about that. First fact over here, the United States has less than 5% of the world's population. We consume 30% of the energy. There's a country called China that I just read this week has 1,400,000,000 people. We consume more energy than they do. And they, by the way, are the now industrial giant. 30% in your country here. Really great, isn't it? Start to recognize that consumption is our problem. So when Stephen stands up here and hopefully wakes some of you up or alarms you or frightens you, whatever it does to provoke thought, at the end of the day, this all comes down to one word: consumption. And so why we have an ocean that the top people tell me is going to be dead, as a matter of fact, 3 of the 7 top people in the world I interviewed, every one of them independently, without me probing, said by 2047, 48, 49, the oceans are dead. Now, we had this interesting immigrant to America from Germany called Einstein. You ever hear about Einstein? Pretty smart guy. You know, the average person we now realize uses 3 or 4% of our brain. We assume Einstein used 10% of his brain. Well, Einstein said something prolific and profound. He said, when the oceans die, we have 5 years. Now, again, I'm telling you, the top oceanographic scientists in the world are telling you that in 30-some years, the oceans are dead. Is Brian Clement agreeing with that? Yes, because I scuba dive. As a boy, I started to scuba dive all over this beautiful country in the 1950s. And right here in Florida, back in the 60s and early 70s, I used to put on my scuba gear and walk into the ocean, and 10 feet away had brilliant, extraordinary, beautiful coral reefs. I cry when I think about them. I used to have a pet moray eel that we'd go out to a certain reef, and everyone's frightened of the moray eels. They look like snakes, but he knew who we were. This is how smart this creature was. He would actually identify us and come out, and he'd let us pet him. And I would swim out there. That was maybe the length of this auditorium. It's completely gone. Several years ago, we had a big food conference, raw food, living food conference in Jamaica. I got everyone riled up. Come on, let's go scuba diving. You know, we had 300 people, 280 people there, and got 10 of us on the boat, and we went out, and I said, you're going to see the most beautiful coral reefs, and this is more than a decade ago. They were completely dead. It looked like a lake. It didn't look like an ocean. And we're talking about Jamaica, which is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, in the middle of the Gulf Stream, completely dead. University of Florida here, about 8 years ago, put a report out and said why the coral reefs are dying is that humans somehow haven't figured out we shouldn't be pouring raw feces into the ocean. And I can take you to some of the most popular beaches in the world right here in my state and bring you to the pipe and show you them putting your feces out into the ocean directly. Because 50% of the coral reefs are dead because of a bacteria in human feces. Give yourself a hand. We are really smart as humans, aren't we? Smart group of people. So where does this all end? Consumption. Consumption. You have got to stop consuming. And if you are going to consume, we have to consume something. We have to make prudent and intelligent choices. So going from a big, heavy-set guy smoking cigarettes and other things I won't discuss on film, I basically one day woke up, not because I was conscious, because I was frightened. I thought I was going to die. And by the way, I was correct. If I'd kept my lifestyle going and kept consuming and kept smoking cigarettes, I would have died. And many of you out there today are dying, and you're suffering unnecessarily. And it's because you're taking more than you need, and it's that simple. We know in science, ever since 1935 at Cornell University, the birthplace of nutrition. There wasn't a field of nutrition that I'm proud to have worked in for over 40 years until 1928. A group of courageous and intelligent biologists said, you know, ever since 1905, when young William Fletcher in London, England, discovered the first nutrient called B vitamins, there isn't really an established science. Let's create a science, and Cornell did it. So thank you for that great American institution. At the time, America was great. By 1935, they asked the most important question. Who lives the longest and who has the least disease? And they found out that people who eat the highest nutritious foods, like we're going to be speaking about, not only am I going to speak about that, and the 60 years of clinical research we've done on human beings with blood tests and science to prove it, but speaker after speaker after speaker is going to speak about this during the next 10 days. And you better open your ears and get your tape recorders on and start to record this and listen to it and get it through your head. So people who eat the highest nutritious food in the smallest amount, not the largest amount, not consumption, live the longest and have the least disease. So when legitimate scientists occasionally but rarely come to Hippocrates and they critique what we've been doing with people, the one overwhelming thing that they can point to, because these studies have been done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times after 1935 at other universities globally, is it must be the low caloric intake and the high nutrition of the Hippocrates living food, plant-based vegan diet that works. And yes, I concur. But there's other things that we're just now discovering. Other things. And the good news is science is finally turning in the right direction, because obviously we've been looking in the wrong direction for so long. So we have to start eventually going to the right garden and picking the right truths. One of the things that we also understand is that most organic food today is commercially grown and has very little nutrition in it. How many of you know that? So again, I'm not going to be here I'm not a good guy, bad guy kind of a guy. If the good guys are doing bad things, I'm going to tell you that. And one of the things that Stanford University showed us just a few years ago, and I totally concur with, is when they looked at commercially grown organic food in big multi-million-dollar million-acre gardens in places like California, where the water's going away, which I'm going to speak about in a minute, you literally have about the same amount of nutrition in that organic food that you have in commercial food that is sprayed. Now, obviously, I'm going to tell you to always eat organic food because it's going to at least take away what? Pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, and God knows what else it takes to put that together. But on the other hand, we have to start to become sustainable. When I was a little boy, right here in my country, and when I go to Europe, next month I'll be in 10 countries in Europe speaking, I still notice there you have gardens. Many of you still have gardens in your backyard. But right here in the United States, we had that. All my aunts, my uncles, my grandparents, all my friends, they had little gardens that from the spring until the autumn, if they were in the north, grew. Well, we've got to get back to that. And the best garden that all of us can have, listeners worldwide, get this, is sprouts. Because we can take a pound of seeds, organic seeds and produce 10 pounds of food. Now, we talk about sustainability. Do you know how large a steer is before they kill a steer? The average steer that you've been eating, I used to eat, and is becoming the favorite thing on the menu in the developing countries that now have developed, is 1,200 pounds. Do you know how many acres of land, over 50 acres of land it takes to create a 1,200-pound steer so that you can eat hamburgers? You can eat filet of steak. You can eat whatever you call. Do you know how many thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people with sustainable farming, sustainable gardening we can feed from 50 acres of land? Do you realize that 1 billion people, as we speak during this conference, 1 billion people around the country, around the world, have to move to new places, new regions, because they've run out of food? Out of the 7 billion people we have on the planet now, in the next 5 years, 2.5 billion of those people are going to have to move to find water. Here in the United States, as this conference is held, we actually have a number that's scary, because the top scientists in the world, not just in my country, have now predicted that California will not get rain over the next year, but will run out of water in the next year. So the listeners here may know it because many of you are Americans, but globally, California produces most of America's food. So this great nation that brought us to the moon, that eradicated Adolf Hitler, that created a viable middle class, that I'm proud to be an American citizen, somehow didn't know that these things were going to happen. Somehow failed us. And you've been part of the problem. So don't blame them, blame you. You ate the hamburgers. You use the plastic. You wear the polyester clothes. You eat the fish. So together we have to buy into this. We no longer can sit back in our easy chairs with a clicker and blame the president or the prime minister or the Congress or the parliament. We are humans, and together as a human race, we have to resolve this. And the one thing I know throughout history is that when things get bad, if humans work together, we can overcome them. There is no doubt in my mind that we cannot put the brakes on and stop environmental and health degradation on the planet as we speak. So Stephen, who has children, and I, who have children and grandchildren, petition you as human beings, not as leaders, not as nutritional scientists, as people. Please, please, don't feel hopeless. You have the power to change. It's always been one person who's changed the course of humanity. And you can do it. There's no doubt that we have that ability. If you look behind us as I speak, you look at the kind of things that are going on that are all unnecessary. The other thing I've evaluated over the last 40-some years is that all of the problems are things we don't need. For instance, I have a new car called a Tesla. You ever hear about a Tesla car? Okay. I spent 2 years saving money so I could have integrity. Here I was going to environmental conferences and talking like a big shot and telling you how incredibly, above the fray I was. I wasn't above the fray. I was driving a car that put pollution into the air. I got a Tesla because Tesla is the future. And by the way, Tesla, by next year, is going to have a device that you can buy, a little box that you can put into your house and come off the grid. That means you no longer have to pay money to the local electric company. That's the future. There are remedies. Hippocrates Health Institute for 60 years have had the sickest and the smartest people in the world come to us. After other things have failed, they've tried all of the nonsense. And we've watched thousands of people bring about their own recoveries. And this is not magic, and it's not a sales pitch. When I was just a young boy, my father said to me, "You have chosen to do the hardest job on the planet." And I was a little puzzled. I didn't know what he means. He said, "You're trying to tell people that they've got to buy themselves." He said, People don't want to buy themselves. They want you to fix them. Well, we can't be fixed. The only people that can fix you is you. The doctor now that I respect and honor, and God bless them, because the army of love is growing. We have tens of thousands of doctors called lifestyle medicine doctors. And tomorrow I'm going to honor some of those and talk about the future of medicine, because in this room we have the future of medicine. You're going to meet tomorrow during this conference. We are not going to sit back and whine about the system. We're going to create a new system. We don't have to battle these people. We have to love these people into coming along with us. We don't have to say there's a wrong and a right. We can just say there's a right way to do it. And by the way, the shit's hit the fan and you're going to die too. So we better all just go along with this. We better go along with the program, because there's only one program necessary now. The good news is we're reducing things to a point we don't have options. Isn't that wonderful? A colleague of mine out in California, who seems to be in the know, said, do you know behind closed doors, they're not talking about people in Hollywood not sprinkling their lawn. They're talking about asking the dairy and the meat industry to stop working in California. Because where water goes to is not you sprinkling your lawn. Shame on you if you're sprinkling your lawn, although I do. But bottom line is, it's you eating meat and dairy that destroys the water. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of times more water is used in that. So when I hear somebody say, I'm an environmentalist, as they're eating a hamburger, or organic chicken, they are lying. They're deceiving themselves. Environmental degradation is exactly the same as health degradation. The great philosophers and theology people over history have said the same thing, that reap as you sow. There's nothing more powerful than that term. Do you know what that means? Some of you have other languages, so I'll explain. What you do is what you'll receive. Who you are is what you'll attract. So change you. Mahatma Gandhi taught us that. He didn't say, oh my God, I'm going to come in here. I have a lot more Indian people than we have English people. As a matter of fact, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times more Indian people than English people. He could have said, here, everyone take guns. We're going to get rid of the English. What did he do? He changed himself. And from that example, his countrymen, where he didn't grow up, he grew up in South Africa. He was an Indian by heritage. He was not an Indian, but his blood was Indian. Looked at him and said, my God, this peaceful, loving man, what he's doing feels better than violence. Martin Luther King, God bless his soul, I had the privilege to be with him a couple of times and get intimately to know his wife, Coretta King, who was my mission mentor. Without her, I wouldn't be the man I am today. As without my wife, I wouldn't be the man I am today, or my children, or my mother, or my father. We become who we are because of who we've been with. And those examples are what we need. So when you choose to not talk a good talk, but be the person with values, your children see that. And your children mimic that. And in your community, you don't have to say, we want a global outreach. In your community, start to speak about these things and get the facts. I can promise you, whatever Stephen has presented today, we will give you if you ask for it. Whatever I present today, we will give you if you ask for it. You can take into your communities these statistics, and I'm sure that 90% of the people in your very communities worldwide do not know these statistics. When I talk to educated people, highly educated people, people with 2 and 3 graduate degrees, most of them don't know what I'm talking about when we speak about these things. Now think about that. Can you imagine the poor person who's working 70 hours a week, and the husband is working or the wife is working 70 hours a week, and all they do is get their news before they fall off to sleep, 30 minutes before they fall off to sleep. What do they know? Probably the last thing they saw is some sexy-looking person taking a drug, and they're thinking, gee, that looks good, maybe I should. Isn't that true? This is why they've convinced us, listen closely, the number one drug consumed today is antidepressants. So rather than do something, people want to put the light out. Do you follow? If we take an antidepressant, it's just a legal way to take a street drug. And basically, if you go on an antidepressant, you don't have to, we don't have to watch The Real Truth About Health. We don't have to listen to this stuff. Everything's going to be okay. And then you blame God. The other absolute insane thing I see going on. God's going to take care of this. God is taking care of this, by the way. God is not going to take care of this. God gave you perfection. You've actually spit in God's face and thrown it on the ground. That's what's going on. So to blame God's going to take care of it. And then I hear some real idiots, New Agers, tell me that don't worry about it. Some Martians are going to come and save us. Why are you waiting for something rather than doing something? That's the question. Why are you waiting for something rather than doing something? The last thing I'm going to talk about today is the Bible things that you can do. And we're going to go step by step. The number one thing you can do is today make a pledge that you and the people in your life, if you have young children, are going to make a commitment to have a plant-based diet that's organic. Do we all agree with that? Yes. Okay, give yourself a hand. So I want you listening out there around the world to make that pledge. So let's put our hands up. From here on in, I will not consume animals. I will consume plant-based organic diets. That's number one. Number two, I want you to think about the water you're consuming. When my children were growing up, all four of my children, when we went into a bathroom, I didn't ever let the water run, and we took one towel. By the way, when my hands are clean, I'm giving my child a clean towel. And sometimes I had 4 children in there, and we'd use one towel. Think about these things. When you're driving, do you really need to drive a half a block to go to the store? These are really viable things. And look, I'm not saying I'm above the fray. I do these things sometimes. But at least now I'm awake enough some of the times to catch myself and say, oh, what am I doing? What am I doing? And the most important thing that I want to say to you today is find a way to see positive in everything. You know, this can be a very depressing bit of information we're going to give you over the next 10 days with the leading authorities. There's not going to be one person on this stage that doesn't have the level or more competence than I have. You can pit us against the top scientists in the world, and we will literally win the debate. That's the level of the next 10 days people coming in here. So it can be very depressing. But I want you to see this in a positive way. This is not about the problem. This is about the resolution. Again, to start where I end where I began, I should say, governments are not going to do this. Governments have an inability. They're broken worldwide. They cannot do this anymore. But citizens can do this. And I don't mean American citizens. The world has to learn. America's not able to do it alone anymore. That we're a global community. And probably one of the countries that has the least will to do this is America at this point. Because why? 70% of us are on drugs, and the number one drug happens to be antidepressants. So that's the problem. Start to see that you are more important than you think you are. You're not a follower, you're a leader. That when you were born as a leader. There was no difference between you and the most powerful person who's ever lived. The difference is that person perceived themselves as capable. Do you follow that? Perceive themselves as capable. And in my work, I've been so blessed to see that what I'm saying isn't rhetoric, or it isn't, philosophy or embellishment in any way. Every day I'm given the privilege to work with people who are facing death. Not one day, not 2 days, but over 300 days a year I'm sitting somewhere in the world or at my desk with people who are facing death. And I watch one after one make the choice not to die. Now, if you can reverse death in some cases, why can't you change the course of humanity at this point? So are we going to do that? Yes. Give yourself a giant hand.